Welcome to Review 16, World War I. When we are looking at the causes of World War I, we should remember the acronym MAIN, M-A-I-N, the main causes of World War I. And the MAIN represents militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. Militarism means that both the Army and the other military forces are given a very high profile and priority by the government. And in the years leading up to World War I, growing tensions between the countries had led to an arms race, as each country tried to outdo the others. As we'll see in a second, the armies of both France and Germany had more than doubled between 1870 and 1914. We can see in this table the buildup in the size of the armies. Russia, a very large country, a very large army, had Germany quite concerned, as had France, and Germany was worried about the fact that France and Russia were friendly. So Germany worked to increase its military. In 1906, the British introduced the Dreadnought class battleship, a modern battleship in every sense of the word. As soon as the Dreadnought came out, all other ships were outclassed. The Germans, trying to keep up with the British Navy, soon followed with their own battleships. And here's the center part of the arms race. Britain builds the Dreadnought, Germany builds 2 battleships. Germany built 2 battleships, now Britain has to build 3, and the race and the size of the navies escalated. For nearly 300 years, European nations have been forming alliances with other countries to create a balance of power throughout Europe. Essentially, they wanted to make sure that no single country would become so large and powerful that it would dominate. So, if the concern was France becoming too large, without the alliances, France could pick off the other countries one at a time. With the alliances, France would be countered with combinations of countries that ended up with the same size military and economies. The whole idea, again, is keeping a balance of power so not one country would dominate. As we discussed in a previous review, by 1871, Prussia had united Germany and was one of the strongest countries in Europe. To protect itself from the French, Germany signs an alliance with Italy and Austria-Hungary, that in the case of an attack, they would all work together. This became known as the Triple Alliance for the 3 countries. On the other side, Britain, France, and Russia entered into an agreement known as the Triple Entente. Now, how I remember which is which, Entente is a French word, and that tells me that France was on that side. And I know France and Germany are not friendly, and so Germany then has to be the Triple Alliance. The letter I in the acronym MAIN stands for imperialism. And competition for colonies as well as within Europe had significantly increased the tensions between European countries. Additionally, colonized people resented their status and sought their independence. This also increases the tension. As a reminder, imperialism is when stronger nations politically, economically, and socially control weaker nations. Or as we put it earlier, effectively, it's a large country bullying smaller countries. Nationalism, this idea that you wanted to rule yourself, kind of was the opposite. So the smaller countries wanted to rule themselves. By the late 1800s, nationalism had become a strong force in Europe, and this idea that your country was not only the best, but the greatest ever, led to increasing tensions. In the late 1800s, we see a crisis in a southeastern region of Europe known as the Balkans. Effectively, the Serbians, right here, were a Slavic people. Across the border in Austria-Hungary, in this area, were Serbian people living in Austria-Hungary. Serbia wanted those people in that land to be part of their country. but they knew that Austria-Hungary would not willingly give up the land or the people. So Serbia believed that the only way this would happen is if they could instigate a war in which the Austrian government collapsed and they would be able to seize that land. In June 1914, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and his wife were assassinated by a member of a Serbian nationalist group. Again, they hoped that the assassination would start a war that would bring down the Austria-Hungarian Empire. So while Serbia's plan did work, the results were much greater than anyone could have imagined. Austria declares war on Serbia. Serbia is backed up by Russia, who are also Slavic people, and they then threaten Austria. Germany has an alliance with Austria, and so it continues. Within a week, Germany had declared war on Russia, and World War I was underway. So let's take a quick overview of World War I. Germany had been worried by the alliance between France and Russia, and were very concerned about the possibility of having to fight the war on two fronts at the same time. In 1905, the Germans developed what they called the Schlieffen Plan. This was a plan to address that problem, to prevent having to fight a war on two different fronts at the same time. The idea was, Russia was a very large country, and the Germans believed it would take about 6 weeks for the full Russian army to be mobilized. You might remember that in 1870, war between France and Germany, Germany wins relatively quickly and easily. So Germany thinks that if they attack France, they will knock them out of the war before Russia's army is completely ready. They believe that if they knock France out of the war quickly, Britain will not join in. And they can then turn and give their attention to Russia. What the Germans didn't know about was a secret treaty between Britain and Belgium that guaranteed Belgium's security. So when Germany crossed through neutral Belgium on its way to France, Britain declared war. In bitter fighting, the two sides tried to go around the other side in a flanking movement, and what you ended up was this move that took the fighting all the way to the English Channel. This red line represents the front, or where the troops dug in and dug trenches to avoid the machine gun fire and the artillery. By early 1915, both sides had dug in, and you had a few hundred miles of these trenches, and the fighting was known as trench warfare. Essentially, for the next 4 years, at the cost of a great number of lives, the armies fought over the same ground again and again and again. Now, we need to take a look at those involved, because once the fighting starts, we see a shift in the names. The French, the British, and the Russians were called the Allies. Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria were known as the Central Powers. And the Central Powers gets its name from the fact that Germany was located in the central part of Europe. In March 1917, after 3 years of bitter fighting, things were not going well for the Russians. Riots broke out over the government's handling of the war and problems with food. This marks the beginning of the Russian Revolution. We will talk in more detail about the Russian Revolution in an upcoming review, but for now, we're just going to talk about how it affected World War I. The new Communist Party was desperate to get Russia out of the war. In negotiations with the Germans, they gave up a significant amount of land to sign a peace treaty. In this map here, the blue represents the land that the Germans got from Russia, and the red, the land that Austria-Hungary got from Russia. This was a significant amount of land and very valuable land because of agriculture and raw materials. But again, it got them out of the war. It also allowed Germany to take the 1 million men that had been fighting on the Eastern Front and bring them here on the Western Front to try to change their fortunes and break the stalemate of the trench warfare. By 1917, the Americans had joined the war and were arriving in increasing numbers, and Germany, in a last bid to win the war, took those extra million men and started a major campaign, and they were able to push in significantly. But the Allies were able to rally and drive the Germans back, and with increasing numbers of German soldiers surrendering and rioting and despair home in Germany, Germany begins to talk about peace. So let's take a look at the United States and how it ended up in World War I. In general, American public opinion favored the Allied cause, but the U.S. officially remained neutral for more than 2 years. They did not want to get caught up in European squabbles. Now, American business interests leaned to support the Allies because they had lent so much money to the governments of Britain and France. If the Allies lose the war, the American banks and the American government would lose that money. Shortly after the war began, Britain declared a blockade of German ports in an effort to starve Germany out, and began intercepting merchant ships that were sailing towards Germany. Germany, on its side, in an attempt to starve Britain out of the war and to keep France from being resupplied, deployed submarines known as U-boats or undersea boats that were used to sink ships without any warning. A German submarine sank the British passenger ship Lusitania with a loss of over 1,000 lives, 200 of whom were Americans, and also torpedoed the French passenger ship Sussex, which was able to make it back into port. Here you can see the headline of the New York Times as it discusses the sinking of the Lusitania. In an effort to keep the United States out of the war, Germany agrees to what is called the Sussex Pledge. Essentially, they would not target passenger ships, and they would make sure that any merchant ships that they attacked were actually carrying weapons and war materials. But inspecting the ships was difficult. By January 1917, Germany was convinced that the only way to get Britain out of the war was to step up their submarine attacks and starve her for food and supplies. To do this, they would resort to unrestricted submarine warfare. In other words, if you were sailing toward Britain, it didn't matter what country your ship was from, they would attack it and sink it. Recognizing that this might bring the United States into the war, the German Foreign Secretary sends a telegram to the German ambassador to Mexico. This is known as the Zimmermann telegram because the Foreign Secretary's name was Zimmermann. In it, he suggests that the ambassador approach the Mexican government and suggest that Mexico join the war on the side of the Germans and attack the United States. Germany would help with money and equipment, and in exchange, Mexico would be rewarded when the war was won. The reward for Mexico would be regaining the lands taken from Mexico by the United States, including the states of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. Mexico very wisely declined the opportunity. When the news leaked about the Zimmermann telegram, Americans were outraged and clamored that war with Germany was necessary. Germany did resume unrestricted submarine warfare, and in the next 2 months sank 6 American ships. And on April 6, President Wilson signs a resolution: America has entered the war. Let's now take a look at what life was like during World War I. On the home front, with millions of men in the military, employers were forced to turn to women for jobs that had traditionally been limited to men. The women excelled in these jobs, and here you see pictures of women working in munitions factory, making ammunition and shells. On this main picture here, these are women creating or working on gas masks. Women also had to replace men on the farms. So you had what is known as the land army, where volunteers from the city could move to the country to work on a farm. Women worked as welders, mechanics, truck drivers, and car drivers, generally all the occupations that had traditionally been men's jobs. Let's take a look at what life was like for the soldiers. More people were killed by artillery fire than by any other weapon in World War I. A close second would be machine guns. To protect themselves, troops dug trenches. The space between the opposing trenches was called no man's land, and the troops would fight back and forth over this same piece of land all along the front. World War I sees a number of new technologies in place. Machine guns, poison gas, and the gas masks that resulted, tanks, aircraft, and zeppelins, which are large dirigibles, lighter than air flying machines. The cost of the war was horrific. Millions of men killed, many more millions wounded, and all the combatant nations were exhausted financially and spiritually. They agreed to an armistice, which is a stop in the fighting. So on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, the fighting stopped. This is why we celebrate Veterans Day on November 11th. Although the fighting stopped in November, it took 2 months to gather representatives from the 27 involved countries to come to Paris to the Palace of Versailles. When American President Wilson arrives in Paris, he brings with him a peace plan proposal known as the 14 Points. The first 5 points of Wilson's proposal addressed eliminating the causes of war. The next 8 points addressed the right of peoples self-determination, in other words, to govern themselves. And finally, with the 14th point, it called for the creation of an association of nations known as the League of Nations. There were 2 very different approaches to the peace treaty. President Wilson wanted a peace treaty that would prevent future wars. However, Great Britain and France had been decimated by the war and wanted revenge as well as compensation for their significant losses. The peace conference used Wilson's 14 points as a starting point. However, the final peace treaty was much different and very harsh for the Germans. The Allies demanded that Germany take responsibility for starting the war and pay reparations for the war damage it had caused, and these were significant amounts of money. In many ways, the peace treaties ending World War I created a flawed peace. It created more problems than it resolved. One of the consequences of the war was that 4 empires were dismantled or broken up: the Austro-Hungarian, the German, the Russian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. Here you can see the differences between before the war and after the war and the breakup of these various empires. Finally, we need to talk about the mandate system. The mandate system, very simply, addresses the colonies that the Central Powers had. After the treaties, those countries, Germany, Austria, the Ottoman Empire, lost their colonies, and they were taken over by the British and the French. The British and French couldn't just say that they were taking the territories, so the mandates were essentially considered, these countries aren't quite ready to be run independently, so Britain and France are going to keep an eye on them and help them out. Essentially, Britain and France just divided the territory between them. Thank you for joining us as we reviewed World War I.